Good evening, everyone. Welcome for most of you. Welcome again, I guess. And for those of you that weren't here, welcome too. This is the last event of today's Copernicus Festival. And this is a discussion session about things that we have already touched upon just a couple of minutes ago. If you weren't here or you didn't watch the video, you're all welcome to watch Professor Günspoon's lecture on planetary intelligence, which we will mention in our talk, I guess. But this is a new event, so let's have a new start. On the stage, beginning from my right and your left, Professor January Weiner, the second biologist, then Professor January Weiner, the second biologist, and Professor David Günspoon, astrobiologist. And my name is Łukasz Lamża. I'm an humble philosopher at Copernicus Center here in Krakow, and I will moderate the talk. Also, using my privilege as the host, I shall begin with the first question. If I remember correctly, you defined astrobiology as the science of the possibility of life in the universe. So I guess you can guess my question. What is life? Sorry, we have to do it.
No, I agree. It's a good question, and we can't avoid it all evening. And of course, if astrobiologists are looking for life, we can't look for something without having a definition. But there's a paradox there because we only have one example of life. Even though you can talk about all the biodiversity on Earth, we know that it all stems from one origin, it's all related. So we have one example, and in science, you can't define a class of phenomena with one example. So you can say once we find other examples of life, I can imagine maybe 100 years from now, we'll have dozens of life forms that we know around the universe. Then I think we'll have a better definition of life. But now we have this paradox that we're looking for something we can't completely define, and we can't define it until we find it. But, we have these provisional definitions that I think are pretty good. We say things like, it's a self-perpetuating chemical reaction. Maybe sometimes we talk about a boundary, a membrane, and we say it evolves by Darwinian selection. We say these various things, and then people can take shots and criticize that definition, and it's not perfect. But I think that's a reasonable sort of, I would say provisional definition that maybe we'll refine sometime in the future when we've actually found more examples.
Now, would you like to comment on that?
I wanted to follow the same question, because the definition used by NASA is what you said, some self-sustainable system which can evolve. But if you go to some external planet to see whether the life is there or not, how can you recognize anything with this definition? Your probes sending extraterrestrial planets or things like that must find something which can be defined as life, extraterrestrial life.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, we don't have a machine like on Star Trek. They have the tricorder, and you point it and you say, it's dead, Jim, or it's alive. If we had that machine, it'd be easy, but we don't have that. So how do we detect it? One thing we can do is look for what we think are the environmental signs of life. Like if you were an alien coming to Earth, you'd notice that our atmosphere is really unusual. And that wouldn't tell you 100% there's life, but that would say, let's look at this planet more closely, and you would discover the organisms. So we can find environmental clues that tell us there's something strange there, and then examine that locale more carefully and try to find organisms that are behaving in this way. I mean, we had these experiments on the Viking lander on Mars, our first lander on Mars, that were trying to find metabolic activity. We actually squirted water in these things and tried to see if anything was reproducing. Now it seems very naive, that experiment. But that was at least an attempt to say, well, maybe there's something that we can catch it in the act of reproducing,
But now, all the years later, what would be the particularities of the environment that you would be looking for? just oxygen, or?
I would broaden it from oxygen to say some departure from thermodynamic equilibrium that we really can't explain in any other way. And what I mean by thermodynamic equilibrium, sorry, that's a nerdy term, but basically gases that shouldn't be mixed, shouldn't be together without some reaction happening. Like if you walk into a room and there's well, let's back up. If you walk into a room and there's a bunch of dogs that look hungry and there's a bunch of steaks over here, that's out of equilibrium. They shouldn't mix. The dogs are all going to go eat the steaks, right? So that tells you something's just happened. Somebody's just put those steaks in there or they'd be gone, right? So chemically, if you see an environment with two chemicals that should not be together without reacting, you say that that is out of equilibrium. And that means that there's some active process feeding one of those gases into the environment. So something like that is what I would say.
Yeah, would you detect the life on the Earth during the first billion of years by that way?
Maybe not. That's a good point. Before Earth had its oxygen signature, but maybe you would, because we think there was probably, some people think there was a methane signature then. So there might have been some other more subtle disequilibrium. But his point is very good, because when we talk about finding the oxygen, like, you know, we say, oh, Earth is so recognizable, but he's pointing out that for much of the history of Earth, before that 2 billion years ago, that oxygen event I talked about, the Earth would not have had that signature, so you've got to be careful.
Well, would evolution be necessary for something, for us to call it life? You know, I'm wondering, you said reproduction and I think natural selection was also in place, but you mentioned Solaris in your talk, and I wonder if there was planetary scale life composed of a single individual. I don't think normal laws of population genetics could operate, and selection and so forth and so on. So this would be a non-evolving living creature, am I right?
I think you are, but I find it disturbing, because you still have to ask, well, how did it get to be the way it is? You know, the great complexity of life on Earth, and by complexity I even mean one individual bacterial cell, is extremely complex. There's all these mechanisms and feedbacks, and you know, there's a lot going on in there, and that we understand as a result of, you know, many generations and years of evolution. I don't know how you get to a Solaris without some kind of evolutionary process that maybe it didn't start out as a global ocean and then became one. It's hard to imagine it wasn't somehow the result of an evolutionary process, but since Stanislaw Lem is not here for us to ask, maybe we won't know, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is also that this is basically the only mechanism that we know that drives complexity, right? It's, you don't get it with genetic drift or mutations or... So can you imagine, so I would almost say that natural selection, the presence of evolution, is the main characteristic of life. This is, I can imagine life, you know, in ammonia clouds or dust plasma or whatever, but I cannot imagine life that doesn't undergo natural selection.
I think that's right. I'm much more comfortable saying, if we want to say that something that we're somewhat confident will be universal, I'm much more confident talking about that process than any specific kind of chemistry or metabolism or structure, because we could just be fooling ourselves in thinking that it's necessary. But, you know, and again, we don't have a great definition, but it's hard for me to imagine any kind of complexity that you would call life arising without some kind of evolutionary process.
Professor, yeah? Oh, microphone, yeah.
One can imagine also this kind of evolution with computer viruses. So this definition is also not very...
But how do you get a computer without something that evolved?
Yeah, well, it's not a strict definition, right? But it's like a condition that sine qua non, right?
I wanted to ask you a question. You wrote a book about the life and evolution of biosphere, and it treats the Earth basically as a whole system. And there is a huge portion about the book about the geochemistry and biogeochemistry of the system. And their life is essentially presented through the eyes of thermodynamics and chemical reactions. There doesn't seem to be, at this level of abstractness, there doesn't seem to be anything that makes natural selection necessary. If we're I mean, can you imagine life without individuals, without genetic inheritance, just simply as a very complex, very interesting chemical process?
Yeah, for us biologists, it's clear. The life, it's actually the life of ecosystems or biosphere. It can be an individual evolving. It can develop itself, but it's not evolution. And also we can't imagine any adjustment to changing environment, things like that, without natural selection and this kind of evolution. So it's clear that you can't define life for one individual. It must be a population, it must be an ecosystem with interactions between these organisms. So maybe I'm too much Earth-oriented, but frankly speaking, I don't imagine life which wouldn't be based on the same rules as the life on the Earth. Of course, there must be differences, because the life on Earth also is changing very much. You mentioned about these disasters, which changed totally the life on Earth. If you wouldn't be, if the last this event with this exoplanet, not planet, but meteorite, something, which caused this catastrophe at the end of Mesozoic. Maybe today, not we, mammals, but some dinosaurs would discuss these topics, so it's very much changing. If you would find life somewhere else than on Earth, they would look differently, but I'm personally convinced that the basis of life would be the same as on Earth. But what do you think about these ideas?
Well, I think, as you said, that there are these sort of nested set of assumptions you can make. Life has to be carbon-based, maybe, or more generally, life has to be based on chemistry, but not carbon. Even more general, or more specific, life has to be DNA and proteins. That I'm skeptical of, that it couldn't be some other system. But the most basic, even before chemistry, is this notion of an evolutionary process. You can imagine life that's not even chemical. I mean, science fiction writers have that it's gravitational or some other, electromagnetic or something, but it's some form of complexity that is evolving. And without that evolutionary process where the more fit individuals survive, and fitness only in this case means the ability to survive. It's almost a tautology, and some kind of heredity so that the good adaptations that lead to survival get passed on. To me, that heredity and selection seems to be the thing that without it, I can't imagine that you would have anything that you would call life.
So maybe it would make more sense to say that we're looking for evolution in the universe, not that we're looking for life, because nobody seems to be able to define life in a satisfactory fashion, and we have quite a good understanding of what is required for evolution, right? So maybe it would just make more sense to say, okay, I don't know what life is, but let's look for evolution in the universe. Would you agree? Would you agree?
I would agree.
For a biologist, would it make a much more workable proposition?
It would, but then you get back to your question of, well, how do you search for evolution? I mean, it's like, where's my machine that looks at a planet and goes, oh, that one has evolution. So then you have to break it down into something that's evolved that you're searching for, right?
Okay, so what is required for evolution?
Okay, you have to have something that replicates with errors, and these errors have to have an impact on the probability of replicating. So, correct? Did I miss out something? And well, it's a mechanism, right? Natural selection is not a theory it's just a dumb mechanism. You have these assumptions, then you observe change. And but the question is, what else can replicate? What kind of stuff can replicate? And we practically know only computer viruses and a certain range of biochemical molecules. And but there are ideas like the dust plasma that there are certain really weird entities that can also form very complex structures and potentially also replicate. If they can replicate with errors, that would be a potential start for evolution.
Would you accept, if it was discovered that entities like stars or stellar size objects replicate and transmit their properties to their offspring, and there's variation, and the length of their life changes according to their properties, would you say, oh, we've discovered life?
Yes.
Totally.
All right. So, because, you know, there's a lot of things in the universe that multiply, I guess, right? So are you interested in it at all, or would it just be a curiosity?
You need heredity, though.
Yeah.
It's not just enough to. You need something that carries the that can reproduce changes. So it's hard to imagine something as simple as a star. You can say, in some sense, you know, there are I'm not sure about stars, but like asteroids and things, they collide, they break up into pieces. You could say that's replicating, but it's hard to imagine that it sort of carries the, you know, the mistakes that have been made and the things that worked for better replication, that it has some sort of heredity. So that's where, but certainly if it was demonstrated that stars were doing this, I would say, yeah, that star's alive.
Okay, good. It's good to know. It doesn't seem like, I mean, I guess it would have already been found. I've read a paper of some people trying very, very hard, stretching it to find something like life in the universe. And there was this argument that stars differ by the amount of metals in their atmospheres, and this changes significantly their lifetime. And then they explode, and the gas that they were made of is used to produce new stars. So something like this, but it's stretching it, right?
That's an interesting point. There is a sort of ecology in the galaxy where stars die, and out of the dead stars, new ones are born over, you know, many billions of years. Well, it depends on the type of stars, millions or billions of years. So that's an interesting idea. If you could demonstrate that there was some quality that got perpetuated and selected for, then I would have to really think about that.
Yeah, we would probably have to come up with precise models of mutation rates, you know, versus replication, because we know how natural selection is interplaying with other mechanisms that act against that, right? So we would have then to figure out, okay, is this really natural selection, or maybe it's dominated basically by star drift, not genetic drift, but star drift.
Right.
And there would be problems with populations and different, no cooperation. No, it doesn't sound. Okay, so does life have to be small? Am I right? You know, we're trying to find signs of evolution in the universe. I mean, looking for goo that's chemically interesting. We will get to that, sure, because we're going to just
I would
get
say
tired, but I wonder, does it have to be stuck to the surface of a planet and being a chemical goo, or should we expect something more funky?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that in, you know, the kind of complexity we understand implies a certain size range, because chemical structures and cellular structures have a certain size range. It's hard to imagine them being sort of millions of kilometers across. But again, maybe that's a sort of narrow-minded selection of just our observation, and we notice what we recognize, what we're similar to. Again, going back to science fiction, there have been some fun stories. There's a famous story by Fred Hoyle, who was a cosmologist, called The Black Cloud, where there's this giant molecular cloud that comes into the solar system and is threatening the Earth, and then there's obviously concern about this, and then it turns out that it's intelligent because there are these sort of plasma discharges acting like brain cells in this thing. So at least on a science fiction level, we can imagine sources of structure and complexity at entirely different scales than we normally think of. But beyond science fiction, it's hard for me to think of a concrete example of something that...
but look, look at yourself. You're really on a different scale than a bacterium, right? If we knew most of the time on Earth, that those were really small organisms, and then suddenly we had this explosion of stuff that was much larger. So we are already, by orders of magnitudes on a different scale.
No, you're right.
So,
and here I've just been giving this talk about a global scale organism, and now I'm completely ignoring that in my answer to your question. So yeah, maybe I have to rethink this. Not only that, if we create technological structures that are much larger, which some people want to, then in a certain sense, just as our brains are controlling, but we say our whole body's alive, not just our brain, we might in some sense say that these technological megastructures are some kind of larger life form. So there's a lot of ways in which we could maybe escape this narrow-minded view that life has to be all on the same spatial scale.
But still, life on Earth began at the scale of nanometers, right, I guess. And so also your 4 types of change on a planetary scale, and this, the Solaris here on Earth happened through individuals and goo and bacteria and so on. It didn't start out as planetary intelligence. I mean, is it even conceivable that life on a planet would start at the planetary scale already? I'm thinking in terms of the words such as lithosphere and, biosphere and cryosphere, right? So lithosphere started on Earth globally. There was a global lithosphere, and it got more and more complex with time, right? Now it incorporates hundreds of types of rocks and thousands of types of minerals. So we have a very complex lithosphere, which is chemically fascinating, but it all evolved as a whole thing all the time, right from the beginning. Yeah? The same with all the other spheres. So is it possible that there was like a global biosphere right from the start, and it just gets increasingly complex all over the planet?
It's funny you should ask that, because, of course, the origin of life is an unsolved problem, right? Like, we have ideas about maybe it was this kind of reaction, maybe it happened at a seafloor vent, or, we have these ideas about the origin of life, but we don't know how it happened. There is a school of thought, and there are papers and books about this, suggesting that it was not a local event, but that it was a global transition, which is kind of hard for me to imagine. I think of it as some magic that happened in one place and then replicated and spread outwards. But I guess the idea is that there was chemical evolution happening, and it became more and more complex on sort of a global scale, and created the conditions so that all of a sudden there could be sort of a phase transition or something where the biosphere springs out of the geosphere. So it's possible that was more of a global event than we imagine.
How do biologists look at these problems? Let's say, okay, what is the simplest Earth-type life that you can imagine that could inspire astrobiologists? Maybe we're looking for too complex things. What would be the simplest state of a Earth biosphere that you would still call a biosphere?
Like it was at the very beginning of life on the Earth, but we simply don't know how it started. This is still a question without answer. I imagine that we can get some more information from some attempts to produce artificial life. Maybe it will be helpful to say, to guess how it was at the beginning of life on Earth. But even these experiments, which are still run by several groups of scientists in the world, they are very far from producing life. Again, it would be a question, what would be the definition if this molecule produced in the laboratory, is it already alive or not? So I just wonder what's going to happen.
But you know what? I mean, actually, if we rephrase this question a bit, it's like, where would we search for life on very young Earth? And this answer to this question has been changing over the years. Like we had that, actually the first answer came from Darwin, who said, imagine a little pond in which life arises. Then we had the soap, and then the different marine, the hydrothermal vents in the deep ocean. And now we think, or many of us think, it was on the surface, in environments that are changing frequently, that are undergoing this dry-wet cycles, and where there is enough both energy and material and possibility for concentrate certain molecules. So maybe we should be, or one should be looking at environments that are very changeable, that really has periodic differences in the state, rather than a deep ocean somewhere that is heated, where you have energy, you have water, you might have molecules, but you don't have really the spatial organization and this periodic differences that might allow you to get local gradients to actually give rise to these replicating molecules.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Certainly the idea that you need to look for environment with flow, not just the right ingredients, but where there is some kind of activity happening, and interchange and flow. The idea of cyclic activity is an interesting one too.
So are you really supporting this Deemer's hypothesis with this terrestrial ponds and this kind of chemical and physical characteristics different from that in deep oceans? So what would you support? Which of those hypotheses?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't feel, I'm interested in, I mean, I think that the seafloor vents is an interesting idea. I think your idea of cyclic surface environments is interesting. I feel like at this point, there are several competing ideas which are all valid, and I guess I don't have a favorite. I think that some of these general characteristics are you need some kind of flow of energy, you need some kind of nutrients. Beyond that, I'm not sure. One way though, I think the best place to look for the earliest signs of Earth life now is on the moon, because there is no record of Earth 4 billion years ago on Earth. But there probably is a record of Earth 4 billion years ago on the moon. In other words, the moon has been sitting there with very little happening, and we know there were a lot of impacts on Earth at that time. So if we explore enough, we can probably find 4 billion year old rocks from Earth on the moon. So that's one reason
That's a really cool idea.
Go back there. Yeah.
I have never heard about that. That would be really, really cool.
It might be hard to find them, but they're probably there.
And they're probably also pretty much, the impact that was able to launch them into space would be really disastrous for little molecules.
And they would be hit for 4 billion years by anything that hits the surface of the moon, right? And gardened.
Yeah.
And irradiated by cosmic rays.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to get lucky and find one that had been buried, and then unbury it.
Oh my, sounds like looking for a needle in a haystack. Yeah, but what you're gonna do.
But maybe leaving Earth, what would be, I mean, Enceladus was already mentioned, so what other places would you be looking for in the solar system?
Well, I mean, some of these icy moons, other than Enceladus, are interesting. We have a spacecraft that's going to be launching to Europa soon, and that Europa is a moon of Jupiter that we know has an ocean on the inside. In fact, probably the largest, in terms of volume, ocean of water in the solar system, much larger than the combined oceans of Earth on Europa. And we believe there's energy flow there, and there's probably organic material. So I think that's a good place to look. Unfortunately, it's hard to get to the ocean because you have to go through many miles of ice to get to it. But we can try to find signs on the surface of the ice. And we mentioned Enceladus. I think Titan is a moon of Saturn that has liquid methane. And again, talking about maybe some other chemical basis for life. There's liquid, there's flow, there's energy, there's a lot of motion and gradients and so forth. So if you're going to look for some kind of life that's not water-based in the solar system, my favorite place to look would be Saturn's moon, Titan. And there's tons of organic stuff falling from the sky there because there's organic chemistry in the atmosphere. So, and then I think I mentioned, but the clouds of Venus are one of my favorite little sort of pet ideas, because even though the surface of Venus is really hot, the clouds are, it's pretty moderate, and there are some nutrients and possibility of something floating in the clouds of Venus. So the fact is we have to explore broadly, because you should get the impression by now we really don't know what we're looking for.
Were you excited? I think 2 years ago there was then it was described as discovery of phosphine in the cloud decks of Venus. Now I guess I'm supposed to say supposed discovery of phosphine. And I wondered at that time, it was an interesting moment because it's a single molecule. It was detected, well then supposedly, in tiny amounts, and it was listed by some people as a biosignature. I remember thinking how subtle the signs of life might be, because Earth is fundamentally amazing from a perspective of a planetologist, I guess. It's very different, and the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere of Earth is astonishing. It's not a tiny admixture of something produced by life. It's 21% or something like this.
It's not subtle.
It's not subtle at all. I mean, Earth is not subtle. It's flashing its life, but how subtle life can be. I mean, because Earth is great. I love Earth. I like this planet a lot, and it's not very subtle. But hey,
nowadays.
But should we expect a planet to be flashing its life so much? I mean, maybe it's just like a 10 to the -7th of something.
Well, I mean, I think that's an interesting observation about Earth. The one inhabited planet we know has flagrant signs of life. It's not subtle. It's like if you were observing Earth from another star system and you're looking at the planets of our solar system and you look at Mars and you go, CO2, boring. You look at Venus, you go, CO2, boring. You look at Earth and you'd go like, whoa, all that oxygen, all that methane, there's something really strange about this planet. It's not subtle at all. So maybe that's a characteristic of inhabited planets. And this gets a little bit back to this idea of Gaia and life as a global entity. Maybe if life exists on a planet and survives for billions of years, maybe that's because it completely takes over the planet and then it won't be subtle. But you mentioned phosphine. So phosphine is this very simple molecule. It's just a phosphorus atom and 3 hydrogen atoms. And there was this big excitement because it was reported to be observed in the atmosphere of Venus. And before this observation was made, there was a group at MIT that tried to look at every possible molecule that could be a biosignature, could be a sign of life in alien atmospheres. And one of the ones they picked as a very promising biosignature was phosphine. And the reason why is because on Earth, the only known source of phosphine is biology. That's not quite true. There's one other source of phosphine, it's meth labs. But it's hard to imagine meth labs without an evolutionary process, unfortunately. So when they saw it on Venus, people said, aha. Now the problem is this observation is disputed, and there may not be phosphine there. It's hard to detect, and there's other people that think they made a mistake, and it's contentious now. But if you find a molecule that is hard to explain without life, it doesn't mean you've found life, but it means it's worth paying attention to and trying to figure out what's going on there.
And there was a second tiny problem. The group of people who published the paper that phosphine is a promising biosignature, they were essentially the same people who later reported the discovery of phosphine, and chronologically they were already working on discovery of phosphine on Venus. So there's a little conflict of interest over there. I mean, it shows the problems of astrobiology, I guess. It's the term biosignature. I mean, to me, a humble philosopher, is really suspect. I understand the concept of something that looks like Earth life. I get it. It makes sense. But I always wonder about, I have this vision of these, gentlemen scientists of the 19th century traveling, with their pipes through Africa. Where's the civilization over here? I mean, because there are no coffee shops, right? And then there's no proper tea, right? There are just some wild brown things walking around offering me God knows what. But there's no intelligent civilization over here, right? It's monstrous. Because they were looking for tea in Congo. So I was wondering, how are we supposed to get past the fact that the term biosignature essentially means something produced by something on Earth?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this gets back to the beginning of the discussion and this paradox of trying to define something that you can't define until you find it. What we generally say when we discuss this and write about it is that any one biosignature does not mean you found life. It means you found something suggestive or possible or interesting, and then you really need to study that more and find other independent indications of that. And in fact, it may be, if we find this on an exoplanet, we may be in the situation where for decades we're not sure, where some people think that we found a biosignature and other people are skeptical, and that's it. We can't do more because it's an exoplanet. We can't get to it. So it may be very frustrating in that, that we don't have a definite yes or no answer. We just have some hints and some intriguing possibilities. But on the other hand, you can imagine if you found a planet that, say, had anomalous oxygen, and then you find that same planet has anomalous methane, and then that causes you to observe that planet for years, and then you notice there's some signature of something like chlorophyll, or maybe not chlorophyll, but some other pigment that's absorbing light and some energy using, you focus on that and you find more and more, and then you might convince yourself you've actually found some life. But one observation, you always have to be careful.
Sorry, yeah?
No, go ahead.
The question to the two of you, to the biologists, not astro, sorry, terra biologists, you have ample opportunity to look at life from a very general perspective, pedagogical perspective, writing the books and so on. What would you call the most unusual and spectacular property of life? Something that someone, an alien looking through planets, would be most amazed by as produced by Earth's life? What's the specialty of Earth's life? Something that you can't really wrap your head around. How is it possible that something like this is in the universe?
It's an extremely good question, which means it's very hard to answer.
Thank you.
But I would say adaptability. I mean, the result of evolution which causes that the life survived on this planet already almost 4 billion of years. And any other process would sooner or later would stop because of, for instance, thermodynamic balances and things like that. What do you think about?
I have no idea. I was just briefly reminded of this story by Stanisław Lem, Journey number 25, where he describes Professor Tarantoga was listening to aliens on a very hot planet, telling each other that basically it's not possible to find life in low temperatures below 800 degrees, and clearly any being on 2 legs would fall over, etc. So I was just thinking, okay, well, what I'm amazed about life on Earth, I'm not sure even, right? I'm afraid of being too Terra-centric. Yeah, actually what you were saying about adaptability, it goes a bit in the direction of what you were saying about Gaia. The problem is, you know, as a humble biologist, I have a problem with Gaia because it doesn't really work well with natural selection. This is also a bit of a problem of what whenever I hear emergent properties, I kind of think, you know, like, okay, by magic then, right? So natural selection operates, when you talk about networks like the rhizomes or anthills or whatever else, or our brain, it's all subject to natural selection. Gaia isn't.
Yeah, no, I mean, we could go off on a tangent about this, and we probably shouldn't, but I agree with you. That's a challenge to the Gaia idea. How do you evolve a global sort of, it's not really an organism, but even a global homeostatic, biologically mediated system through natural selection? There are people that have come up with theoretical answers to this, and I don't know if you'd be satisfied with them, where local selection can kind of become regional selection and then can create mechanisms, and people have identified some individual mechanisms that work very well, like, you know, the dimethyl sulfide being secreted. There are these ocean organisms, little creatures that live in the surface of the ocean that like to be in a certain temperature, and they secrete chemicals into the atmosphere that seed clouds. So when the ocean water gets hotter, these things reproduce and make it cloudy, and then they make the ocean water cooler. So you can come up with mechanisms like that work regionally and then become global.
Yeah, basically helping myself helps the planet, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Agree, but what do you think? Do we accept that?
I'm just thinking about other thing connected with this problem. The life lasts on this planet already almost 4 billion years. And evolution optimizes survival and reproduction of various organisms. So the life is changing all this time, okay? There is nothing like optimization of the life history of the same organism all this time. And as far as I know, you probably know it much better, the conditions on this planet must change quite soon when you count it in billions of years, okay? So the Earth is already close to the end of its survival on this planet. And another thing, my question would be, if you know how long the life would survive on this planet and how long the species of ape called Homo sapiens can survive on this planet. You mentioned at the end of your lecture about this Terra sapiens, okay? So that with Anthropocene, humans are already recognizing the situation and should already start to somehow to stabilize the comfortable situation on Earth. But the problem is that we have our minds evolved something like 15,000 years ago or something like that, yeah? And it didn't change much. And evolution is always preferring individual success. So another question connecting this topic.
Well, it's true we haven't changed. It's true we haven't changed much biologically, but cultural evolution and technological evolution occur very rapidly. And you know, this question you raised about the biosphere of Earth maybe being near the end of its lifetime, from the biosphere's point of view, that means it has a limited amount of time to evolve a species that is capable of intentionally changing the planet. So maybe there's only another few million years left to do that. It doesn't have to be us, but there's not an infinite amount of time for that.
The species doesn't make any decisions, the individuals do.
Well,
and I think this is the problem, how to cause the situation that the culture and science and things like that would influence the individual decisions of humans.
That's true, but yet individuals create institutions that, however imperfectly, make decisions on larger scales. And as I talked about, there are at least some examples of global responses and global decision making and global, it's very, we're not very good at it, but I think you can argue that groups of individuals are capable of acting in a deliberative and, of acting.
But in the situation just right now, for majority of populations of Homo sapiens on this planet, the change of climate is not comfortable at all, okay? But there are some populations of Homo sapiens who are actually satisfied with this change of climate. They don't declare it, but we can imagine that. In some parts of the Earth, the warming of climate would be better for people. This is only an example.
On the short term with climate, there are winners and losers. Yeah. There are countries that are probably going to have conditions that can grow more food or whatever. On the long term, if you sort of crash the global biosphere, you're not really helping anybody.
We know that, but
But you said this about this amazing capability of life to adapt, and I'm just wondering, maybe we are the ones with the stakes are high, but definitely for humans. If the global temperature rises by 5 degrees, it's very bad news for the global economy and agriculture and transport, and videos on YouTube probably would be different. But from the perspective of the bacterial biosphere, it's correct me if I'm wrong. If the temperature on Earth would drop to minus 80 degrees, the biosphere would survive. And the temperature of Earth rose to 80 degrees above Celsius, the biosphere would survive. There would still be life on this planet. Am I correct?
Yes, actually, biosphere already survived minus 80.
Yeah. So, well, we are the ones that should,
Even worse, I would say probably we as humans would also survive. The question is whether our culture will survive. Yeah. Whether there will be anyone left to look for life on other planets.
Yeah, I mean, the most fragile thing is civilization, if you can even call it civilization, what we have now. It's going to be much harder to actually make the human species go extinct because we're so distributed around the planet. And as you say, it's going to be even much, much harder than that to actually wipe out the biosphere. It's very hard to think of something that would completely wipe out life on Earth at this point. But of course, that's not a very comforting thought for me.
Okay, maybe this is the time to give some of the people in the audience have a chance to ask questions. Is there anyone that would like to pop in? Oh, I see a lot of hands. That's excellent. Let's do this. Let's stir the pot. I'm going to walk to the hands. Here you are.
Thank you very much for the discussion. Since we are talking about this evolution in the life in space, let's say, topic, I would like to ask about the evolution of our terrestrial life ecosystem in this perspective that there may be a possibility of wiping out the humanity. So, sorry, just in case we are in this anthropocentric perspective that we are responsible for the life on our planet, would it be possible that some other species could take our place in case we are gone?
Yeah, it's a good question. So if the Anthropocene ends because we do ourselves in somehow, but the biosphere doesn't end, and humans are reduced to just some, back to the way we were several million years ago in the savannah, being hunter-gatherers again. Is it possible, I think if I understand your question, is it possible that some other species would come along and have their own sort of Anthropocene, except it wouldn't be Anthropa, because that means humans, or some other species would come along and develop complexity and civilization and so forth. Is that what you're asking?
May I be more specific? I'm talking, for example, about how our sun has a limited, let's say, time of being active. So we know that we have only like a little bit more than 1 billion of years until the entire planet is pretty much engulfed by our sun. So, for example, if that's enough time for another civilization to appear.
Oh, yeah. I mean, civilization happened pretty quickly. I mean, depending on how you measure it, 50,000 years or 100,000 years or whatever. So, the sun is going to last for several billion more years. Earth's biosphere, because the sun is getting hotter, we've still got, probably hundreds of millions of more years anyways. So it's a much, much longer time scale than the time scale that it took for humans to, whatever happened between us just being another species running around, the savannah and doing what we're doing now, it happened in, tens of thousands of years. So you've got time for that to happen over and over and over and over again before the sun dies.
Then again, it might be that for the remainder of the biospheres, all the species that are coming are just another, bunch of dinosaurs that don't really drive cars or whatever else. And so this is also possible.
It is, because we still don't really understand what what made this happen.
I'm going to come back to the audience, don't worry about it, but maybe a follow-up question. You said 50,000 years, but this is just the last 50,000 years. I was wondering, I think a biologist alien looking at Earth 2 million years ago would probably zoom in on Australopithecus. I can't express this in English, or, these Lucy folk. So they were sort of, I think they would be flagged as interesting, right? Am I right? 5 million years ago, probably an alien biologist looking at chimpanzees would likely say, oh, well, they are heading somewhere, right? Am I correct? Are there any other species that are, they would flag 5 million years ago?
Well, science fiction is full of different alternative ideas which species could evolve to intelligent life.
Okay.
But we definitely know for sure that, know for sure, but we are social animals, so we would definitely look for social animals. Mm-hmm. And, yeah.
Well, I mean, another great example on Earth of intelligent social animals are the cetaceans, the whales and dolphins. People have said, well, you can't develop technology if you're an underwater species because you don't have hands and you're streamlined. But maybe that's wrong. Maybe eventually they would, or they would have a very sophisticated culture, and maybe that would be of interest to the aliens. Other species that have been mentioned in this sort of science fiction way are the corvids. Certain species of birds are really smart and even use tools and have some language. I think we give it honorable mention to the octopus.
Exactly, cephalopods. I mean, they are very. But again,
elephants are pretty smart, and they have trunks they can manipulate.
And they're social.
Yeah, they're social.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
I could imagine elephants creating a civilization and give them a
technological
civilization
100 million
years
of elephants. That would be interesting. Okay, thank you. Yes, we have another question.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask about the technosignatures, I guess also biosignatures. I was wondering, have we done any experiments of looking at Earth as an analog of an exoplanet, like from some kind of a satellite from space, and did some experience to find out whether there is a biology down there or civilization that developed something more advanced. So have we used Earth for this kind of experiments? And if yes, I was wondering what those experiments were. I hope that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a good question. There have been experiments like that done. I mentioned we talked before about the Cassini spacecraft that went to Saturn. Before it went to Saturn, it had to do a flyby of Earth to get the gravitational kick from Earth to send it out towards Saturn. And they actually did the experiment where they turned all the instruments on Earth and tried to treat it like they were encountering an alien planet. And actually Carl Sagan and some other scientists wrote a paper about this, kind of a famous paper. It was published in Nature. It's called something like the Discovery of Life on Earth from the Cassini spacecraft. And they made many observations. Of course, it's not a fair experiment because you're looking at a planet that you know a lot about. But nonetheless, they detected what's called the red edge of Earth's spectrum, which is because of chlorophyll and the absorption by photosynthetic life. There's a very characteristic spectral signature of Earth, and they detected technosignatures, the radio emissions and various, there's a whole list of things they detected. So that's one, and then the other question is if we looked at Earth as an exoplanet, as a single pixel in a telescope, you know what I mean by a single pixel, where you can't resolve, you're not seeing many, many different colors and spots, you're seeing one point of light, which is the way we see other stars and planets elsewhere in the universe. What could you see about Earth? And so people have taken some of our distant spacecraft in the solar system when they were far enough away so that you can only see Earth as a single pixel, and tried to image Earth in different wavelengths and look for signs of life. And again, of course, we do find them, but it's a rigged experiment because you're looking at a planet that you know what life's signature is. So people have done that experiment, and you can find life, but it's sort of not fair because you know what you're looking for.
You would probably wouldn't detect life on Earth like that 2 billion of years ago, right?
I think that's right.
Yeah.
I think that's right.
I think we have space for one more question. Okay, you, sir.
During human activity, we produced more and more oxide of carbon dioxide. That means that the concentration of oxygen gradually decreases. Human being must adapt to a new conditions, to a new lower level of oxygen concentration in for breathing. So, where is a limit? Where is a limit of oxygen concentration where human being can adapt to survive?
Do you know? What's the limit of low oxygen that a human being can survive in?
Well, that's far away from anywhere that we experience any changes in oxygen right now, right? This is because we know that the physiological limits, I mean, Reinhold Messner was able to climb Mount Everest without an oxygen apparatus. So this is not the scale at all. I don't know even whether really oxygen concentrations have been reliably measured to decrease. I don't know about that.
But I have actually read a paper about the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere from the perspective of human physiology, and the increasing concentration of CO2, because oxygen is fine. I mean, people in Peru have significantly less oxygen, but if you increase the concentration of CO2 in just air, there would be cognitive effects of it. And I have seen a prediction that in about 10 to 20 years, there may be measurable decrease in the results of cognitive skills across humanity. Not significantly huge, but measurable. They did these experiments when they gave people problems to be solved. I mean, difficult cognitive problems requiring problem solving, abstract thinking, and they increased CO2 concentration, you know, by 50 ppm, 100 ppm, and so on, and there was measurable decrease. So just to finish the sentence, just the idea was that in a measurable number of decades, humanity may be significantly less capable abstract thinking because of that.
But this is our discomfort with CO2 this is just our sensors, our alarm ringing, basically. So it's not necessarily physiological. It's more like this is our early warning sign that, oh, this is not a good area to be in. We run away, find some fresh air. And so I would think that this might be, if we are asking about adaptation, that there might be still an adaptive, but it's not going to be pleasant, I think. I mean, definitely we might feel these problems in the long term if we don't do anything about that.
So as if we didn't have enough reason already to limit the amount of CO2, here's another one, because we don't want to get so stupid that we can't do anything about all the CO2.
Yeah. Reinhold Messner described dying of cold and lack of oxygen as very pleasant. That's what he said. Maybe getting dumbed down by increasing levels of CO2
because
it's a nice feeling for humanity.
Absolutely not, because CO2 creates panic.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, this is the suffocation that you feel if you are suffocating. Yeah. So lack of oxygen, yeah, it kills you nice and quiet, and you know, like you swim away.
All right.
But rising CO2 level, that's not a good idea.
I actually did several years ago. I did this suborbital astronaut training. I'm not sure why, but I was invited to do it.
Cool.
And one of the things they did, they put us in this chamber and they pumped the air out so we could see what it was like to suffer anoxia. They were watching us very carefully, and if anybody passed out, they would save you. And I have to say, it was very pleasant. The other thing is, it did make you stupid in a way that you didn't realize at the time. They gave us these tests, like a maze, like a child, you know, having to just fill it in. And at the time, I thought, oh, that's easy. I did it perfectly. And then afterwards, I saw what I had done, and it was like I had taken and scrawled like that. So you get overconfident. So it's not good.
But this is not what is. So this is not a danger to us. The oxygen, however much wood we burn, the oxygen levels will not fall to that level. So don't worry. You will just get panic.
Thank you. I guess we will have to be finishing. I don't know. I'm looking for some signs from the people who make the decisions. I don't know. I don't see anyone. So I guess I'm the one to make the decision. And I think we are supposed to be finishing. So let me do this. I'm sure there are more questions, but you know, we're not going anywhere far away, at least for 15 minutes, I guess. So feel free to attack us all, I guess. And thank you all for being here for another great day at Copernicus Festival. Check out tomorrow's schedule. There's a lot of fun to be had. And have a good evening. Thank you all very much.